Hey everybody, Billy Beebe back with you in a shortened version of the Glory Road podcast. Everyone knows the other night Draymond Green had quite the rant going off about Andre Drummond, Blake Griffin, and many other NBA situations. One of the underlying themes of his rant was the Cavaliers are a poorly run organization. Now, Dan Gilbert out with medical issues this past year or two. JB Bickerstaff has cemented himself as a good coach. That kind of leaves one name in the middle, Kolby Altman. The fourth-year GM for the Cavaliers has no playoff appearances currently, and as far as how he is as a GM is something we definitely have to take a deep dive into. Let's take a look at Kolby Altman, the current GM of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Let's start off with some good things Kolby Altman's done. In 2018, the Cavaliers found themselves at the midway point of the season in complete disarray. Names that the Cavs had acquired and big moves they'd made in the offseason were not quite working out. Altman, still fresh in his GM time, completely flipped the roster to be an improved, more athletic, and better fit for LeBron. Despite getting swept in the finals, they did a little bit better movement to fit what they wanted to do against the Warriors. We're talking about the acquisition of George Hill, Larry Nance Jr., Jordan Clarkson, and Rodney Hood. A lot of names that the Cavaliers needed that made a difference for them as the playoffs went on. Now, speaking of other trades, Jarrett Allen. Obviously, recently, the Cavs have found a good player in Jarrett Allen. They really can't believe that they got to flip for him. That was Altman finding a way to weasel his way into the James Harden deal, giving up just Dante Exum and a pick they acquired earlier from Milwaukee to get Jarrett Allen, who they're going to get cheaper than Andre Drummond, and lock him up for a couple more years. Next thing, Larry Nance Jr. After 2 impressive years, Altman locked him down on a team-friendly contract. We've seen Nance get better and better. No way that the Cavs regret that deal. A very good steal there. Next, Garland and Okoro. Those were interesting drafts, and Altman kind of had tough picks to make, but Garland seems like he has a lot of upside. That seems like it'll be a good pick. Nobody behind him has arguably the ceiling that Garland does. And Okoro. Now, the Cavaliers probably could have taken Halliburton, one or two other players that made a bigger difference, but Okoro was finally the fit that Kolby Altman needed, and it seems like Okoro in the future is going to do some really good things with more time. Lastly, one of the great things that he's done is find a way to work in JB Bickerstaff. We'll talk about later, but Dan Gilbert wanted John Beilein. He forced John Beilein on Kolby Altman, and Kolby Altman kind of worked his way to get JB Bickerstaff involved in that too. Eventually, Bickerstaff obviously has taken over the team as head coach and done a very, very good job with the youth movement, the defense, and connecting with the guys. All those are reasons Kolby Altman can kind of get a plus in my head for being a good GM. Next, let's talk about the bad. Altman hasn't done too many terrible things, as next we'll talk about the awkwardness of his moves, but first let's start with bad. I've always found an issue with Kolby Altman giving in to players, their mood swings, their ideas, their forced attitudes. First would be Dwayne Wade. The Cavaliers really needed Dwayne Wade in 2018. He was fitting well with LeBron. Yeah, he had some outspokenness that the Cavs didn't need, but when they hit the playoffs, Wade was an important player that they could have used. He kind of gave in to that lingering issue that Wade wanted to go back to Miami, traded him for just a second-round pick. Next, J.R. Smith. Man, a lot of people forget this, but J.R. Smith is in the same situation that Andre Drummond is right now. After feeling the Cavaliers were not competing how they wanted, and Smith wasn't fitting in like he hoped, he just said, hey, let's find a way to trade me, I'll just sit. Well, the entire season goes by, no trade gets done, and J.R. Smith isn't playing for the Cavs. Yeah, maybe you don't want a guy that's not going to want to play for you, but at the same time, can you really just give in to player demands of heading home? Did Smith get paid? I'm not really sure, but it really isn't a good look for Altman in that case. In a similar fashion, Derrick Rose, a situation that didn't help Kolby Altman. Rose requested 2 weeks off during an ankle injury, and it was half ankle injury, half reviewing his basketball career. This is, again, back in 2018. Altman gives into this, the ankle injury, the time off, this, that. Rose returns and still gives the vibe like he might not want to play basketball anymore. He doesn't know who he wants to play for. Either way, not dedicated to the Cavs. Altman never steps in and really pushes for a player that we've seen over the past couple of years show his worth and ends up trading him as the Jazz release him. But Rose played that year. He ended up finishing out with the Timberwolves, and the Cavaliers really didn't look good for that. The next other Altman fault is kind of the roster construction. At times, the Cavaliers are just missing players and positions that it's kind of obvious they should have had, right? So this whole season, the Cavaliers are missing an extra point guard, too many centers. That's a mix that too many times the Cavs have seen it, and we don't like what we see. Finally, and the most interesting for me, is the awkwardness that Kolby Altman has gone through, that definitely when guys want to go over and kind of rip through Altman, we got to consider this. First, we'll talk about John Beilein. A disaster, no doubt, and that was a Dan Gilbert hire. Dan Gilbert, unfortunately, has had health issues, but he's been less involved with the franchise. Altman's been able to do more. Gilbert was forcing things like Colin Sexton, who the Cavaliers could have had other players such as Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Dan Gilbert forced Colin Sexton on him. He forces John Beilein on him. What a disaster that situation was. The Kevin Love contract, there's some awkwardness there. Now, the Cavaliers, it's not easy for them to get big names, right? The Drummond trade is kind of a disaster and a weird point in this situation. That could be another awkward one if you want. But the Love contract, the Cavaliers locked down a great name. They give him, yes, a lot of money, but they expected him to do big things for them, and they did not want to completely fold just because LeBron was gone. However, Kevin Love has paid them back in no way. He has been terrible. He has not been around in general, and he's been off doing other things instead of playing basketball. He's been injured, this, that. Kevin Love contract, a tough situation to the point that I think I would have rather had Blake Griffin, because at least he had a first year in Detroit that was really, really good. Now, the Kyrie Irving trade's another awkward one. First off, Chris Paul and Jimmy Butler requested trades and ended up being moved right before Irving requested his trade. I always kind of hold Kyrie accountable for that. He waited a long time to request his trade. Second, the Cavaliers, Dan Gilbert and David Griffin could not come to an agreement to stay GM. So Altman, immediately promoted, kind of takes over this horrible situation where one of the Cavs' best historic players with the biggest shot in franchise history wants out. I think by this point we can decide he got a pretty good trade out of it. Irving seems to be a bit of a head case, didn't work out in Boston. Cavs got Sexton, and really Isaiah Thomas turned into Larry Nance Jr. So it's here and there. What an awkward situation there. Now, next, I talked a little bit about Altman's drafting. The facts are the Cavs have had 2 or 3 years in a row where they should have had number 1 picks or close to number 1 picks. The Cavs got the Brooklyn pick from the Celtics. That ended up being 8, which they got Sexton with. But again, they probably figured that would be a top 3 pick. The next year, the Cavs are up into the top picks of the draft. They think, hey, if we go 1 or 2, we get Zion or Ja. You get neither. The Cavaliers end up with Darius Garland, who, still has a lot of potential, but Altman should have been picking 1, 2, or 3. And then finally this year, again, the Cavs are bad enough that they could have been in that top pick formation. They're not. Altman has to make the most of it. Year 4, a tough decision for Kolby Altman going forward as to if he is the guy for the Cavaliers. They've had some blunders. They've had some good things happen, and Altman himself has seen some awkward situations that I'm not sure if Cavs fans can look past. Leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe. Is Kolby Altman the guy for the Cavaliers?